I always thought my life was predictable: lectures, a quiet home, a marriage built on routine. But then, a student walked into my classroom, and with just one look, everything started to unravel. I didn't cross the line right away, but the moment I let the boundaries blur, there was no turning back. I stood at the front of the lecture hall, my fingers gripping the edges of the podium as I surveyed the room. The post-lunch slump had taken over. Half the class sat slouched in their seats, eyes flickering between their notes and their phones, attention divided. I had seen it all before. Years of teaching had trained me to recognize the silent battles between exhaustion and obligation that played out in these seats. But there was one exception. He sat in the front row, as he always did, leaning slightly forward, his chin resting on his hand, eyes never straying from me. Elijah. His presence was a steady, unmoving weight in the room, a quiet intensity that I couldn't ignore. His skin was deep and warm-toned, his jaw strong but not harsh, and his expression unreadable, thoughtful, patient. There was something magnetic about the way he simply watched. Not in an obvious, intrusive way, but with the kind of quiet focus that made me hyper-aware of myself. I cleared my throat, glancing at my notes, though I hardly needed them. Today's lecture felt stale even before I began, and I knew I needed to shake things up if I had any hope of pulling them back in. Maybe it was the restless energy in the air. Or maybe, if I was being honest with myself, it was the way Elijah's gaze never wavered that made me want to provoke a reaction. So, I went for something different. I set my notes aside and leaned against the desk, crossing my arms in a deliberately casual posture. "All right," I said, my voice carrying through the room. "Let's talk about something that actually gets people talking." A few heads lifted, curiosity flickering in tired eyes. Good. I had their attention. "Why do you think society reacts so strongly to age gap relationships?" A ripple of awareness moved through the room. A few students straightened up, exchanging glances. I let my gaze sweep over them before, deliberately, letting it rest on Elijah just a beat longer. He didn't react, not outwardly, but something in his posture shifted, barely perceptible. A hand shot up, but not his. Lena, one of the more outspoken students, leaned back in her chair, tossing her blonde hair over her shoulder with a smirk. "Because people assume one person's getting something out of it." She grinned, letting the implication settle. A few students chuckled, some nodded. I raised an eyebrow, pretending to consider it. "So you're saying people believe there's always an ulterior motive?" "Oh, absolutely," she said, crossing her legs. "People love a scandal." Laughter rippled through the room, and I found myself smiling despite myself. The conversation unfolded naturally from there, each student offering their own take, some serious, some playful. Someone mentioned the idea that these relationships were more mentorship than romance, another suggested they were built on power dynamics. The usual arguments. And through it all, Elijah remained silent. He hadn't shifted in his seat, hadn't even looked away from me. I could feel the weight of his focus like a thread pulling between us. It wasn't obvious to anyone else, but I felt it. "All right," I said finally, still smiling as the room settled. "What about you, Elijah?" A flicker of surprise crossed his face, like he hadn't expected me to call on him. He hesitated just long enough to make me wonder if he would answer at all. But then he cleared his throat, his voice quieter than I'd expected, though steady. "I think," he started slowly, as if measuring his words, "that people get uncomfortable because they assume there's something happening behind closed doors. Something they don't understand." The room went still. He didn't stop there. "They see someone with more experience, and they make assumptions. About control. About power. About who's learning from who." His fingers drummed lightly on the desk, a small, restless movement. "And maybe they wonder how long it lasts. If the younger person can keep up." For a beat, no one spoke. Then, almost as if realizing what he had just said, Elijah stiffened slightly, his jaw tightening. The weight of his own words settled over him, and a faint flush darkened his cheeks. The silence stretched, thick and charged. Then, somewhere in the back of the room, a nervous chuckle broke the tension, followed by a murmur of hushed amusement. I caught the flicker of embarrassment in Elijah's expression as he lifted a hand to his mouth, his fingers brushing over his lips, like he wished he could pull the words back in. I should have kept the class moving. I should have let it go. But instead, I found myself watching him, caught off guard by the raw honesty in his voice, by the way his usually composed expression had slipped just for a moment. And I felt something stir inside me. Something I wasn't sure I was ready to name. I cleared my throat, forcing a light chuckle as I nodded. Interesting perspective, I said, deliberately casual. And probably not too far from the truth. His eyes flickered up to meet mine, hesitant but searching. For the rest of the lecture, I barely heard a word my students said. The drive home felt longer than usual. The sky had deepened into a dull shade of grey, the city passing by in a blur of streetlights and indistinct figures moving along the sidewalks. I kept my hands steady on the wheel, though my mind was anything but. Elijah's voice still lingered in my head. The way he had said those words, not just the meaning, but the quiet weight behind them. The way he had looked at me afterward, uncertain yet unwavering. It unsettled me. Not because I was oblivious to the subtext, but because I had felt something shift within myself in response. I pulled into the driveway, cutting the engine with a sharp turn of the key. The house was dark except for the faint glow of the living room lamp visible through the window. Inside, everything was exactly as I had left it this morning, tidy, quiet, unchanging. My husband, Mark, was already in his usual spot, reclined in his chair, flipping through a newspaper. It was almost comical how predictable our evenings had become. Years ago, we used to fill this house with laughter, conversation, late-night wine on the porch. Now, the silence between us had become routine. I slipped off my shoes and made my way into the kitchen. The air smelled like leftover coffee and faint traces of his cologne, clean, familiar, but lacking warmth. "How was your day?" Mark's voice drifted in from the other room. "Good," I said, stirring a pot on the stove more for the motion than necessity. "Lively class today." "That so?" His interest was faint at best, his eyes still on the paper. Millimeter, I hesitated, the memory of the lecture playing back in my mind. We had an interesting discussion about age gap relationships. That caught his attention, if only briefly. He glanced up, an eyebrow raised. "And?" I shrugged, keeping my tone casual. Some good points came up. The way people make assumptions, how they frame those relationships in their minds before even knowing the details. Mark made a non-committal noise, already retreating into the folds of his paper. I sighed and turned back to the stove, but my mind was already elsewhere. Because as much as I had tried to frame it as just another class discussion, I knew that wasn't the reason my thoughts kept circling back. It wasn't the topic itself that had stuck with me. It was the way Elijah had looked when he spoke, how his voice had softened just slightly at the end, the brief glimpse of vulnerability beneath his usual composure. That should have been the end of it. A fleeting moment. A passing thought. But it wasn't. 2 days later, it was still there, pressing at the edges of my mind, lingering like an unfinished sentence. I had just finished grading papers in my office when a soft knock sounded at the door. I glanced at the clock, late afternoon. Most students had already filtered out for the day. "Come in," I called, expecting a colleague or a stray student looking for feedback. The door opened, and I nearly dropped my pen. "Elijah." He stood in the doorway, hands in his pockets, shoulders slightly hunched, like he wasn't sure if he should be there. But his eyes, those steady, unshaken eyes, locked onto mine. "Professor Carter," he murmured. I straightened, pushing aside the papers. "Elijah. What can I do for you?" A flicker of hesitation crossed his face. He was usually composed, measured. But now, standing in my office, he looked younger, somehow uncertain, almost nervous. "I need some help," he said finally. "Help?" I repeated, my mind struggling to keep up. He nodded. "With the coursework. Private tutoring." Of all the reasons I had imagined for him showing up unannounced, this hadn't been one of them. Elijah wasn't the type to struggle with academics. If anything, he was one of the more insightful students in the class. I leaned back, studying him. "You don't seem like someone who needs extra help." His jaw tensed just slightly, but he held my gaze. "I do. I've tried studying with other groups, but it's not working. I think I'd focus better one-on-one. There was a strange sort of weight in his words, something deliberate beneath the surface. I felt it settle between us, heavy and unspoken. I hesitated, my fingers tapping lightly against the desk. This was risky. I knew that. A part of me should have shut it down immediately, told him to seek help elsewhere. But I didn't. Instead, I found myself nodding. "All right," I said slowly. "We can set something up." A flicker of relief passed through his expression. "I can pay," he added quickly, as if needing to justify the request. "I know professors aren't supposed to tutor outside of class without compensation. I want to make it worth your time." I shook my head, a small smile tugging at the corner of my lips despite myself. "That won't be necessary." We settled on the details 2 evenings a week, after hours. He would come by my house, where it would be quieter, more focused. I gave him the address, and he nodded, slipping the piece of paper into his pocket before glancing back at me. There was something unreadable in his expression, something hovering just beneath the surface. "Thank you, Professor Carter," he said softly. I should have corrected him. Told him to call me Evelyn, at least outside of class. But I didn't. Because, deep down, I knew the moment I allowed that barrier to slip, there would be no going back. That night, I lay awake in bed, staring at the ceiling. I should have said no. I should have turned him away. But the truth was, I hadn't wanted to. The first evening Elijah arrived, I was more aware of my own anticipation than I cared to admit. I had spent longer than usual making sure the house was in order, adjusting the lighting, airing out the room, choosing a place where we wouldn't be disturbed. It was an unnecessary effort, really. This was just tutoring. That's what I kept telling myself. Mark had retreated into his study, where he would likely stay until bedtime, absorbed in his own world. That was how it always was between us, separate routines, parallel existences that only occasionally overlapped. When the knock finally came, I hesitated for just a second before opening the door. Elijah stood outside, his posture relaxed but his gaze alert. Dressed simply, he looked different outside the classroom, more composed in a way that unsettled me. He stepped inside, taking in his surroundings with quiet curiosity. I led him to the table where I had set up our materials. The arrangement was deliberate, structured to keep us focused. A safe distance. A clear purpose. I had planned this carefully. At first, everything proceeded as expected. The conversation stayed within the bounds of academia, discussion of psychological theories, studies on attraction and perception. He listened intently, nodding at the right moments, taking notes without distraction. Yet there was something different about the way he absorbed my words, as if he were reading between the lines, looking for something beyond what I was saying. It was subtle at first, the way the air in the room changed. A pause held a second too long. A shift in posture. The way his fingers tapped lightly against the table when he was thinking. At one point, he made an observation about the way people project their own fears onto others, how assumptions about relationships are often just reflections of personal insecurities. The words felt weightier than they should have, lingering between us in the space that had become too quiet. I realized, with a sudden clarity, that I was paying more attention to him than I should have been. Not just to his words, but to his presence. The way his voice dipped slightly when he was deep in thought. The way his jaw tensed when he considered something carefully. The boundaries between professor and student had always been clear, but tonight, they felt blurred in a way I hadn't anticipated. I told myself it was just my imagination. That I was overanalyzing the moment. That nothing had actually changed. And yet, when the session ended and he gathered his things, I found myself walking him to the door instead of simply letting him leave. A pause. A hesitation. A moment that felt just a little too charged. He met my gaze, something unreadable flickering in his expression, and for a fraction of a second, I wondered if he was about to say something neither of us could take back. But he didn't. Instead, he gave a small nod before stepping out into the night, leaving me standing there with my thoughts. I closed the door, exhaling slowly. This was just tutoring. That's what I needed to believe. 2 days passed, yet the memory of that evening remained with me, lingering in quiet moments, creeping into my thoughts when I least expected it. I told myself it was nothing. A misplaced sense of awareness. A meaningless shift in atmosphere. But deep down, I knew better. The routine of my life carried on as usual. Mark barely spoke over dinner, his focus absorbed by the news on television. The house remained quiet, predictable, unchanged. And yet, I felt different. As if something beneath the surface had begun to stir. When Elijah arrived that evening, I was already waiting. The house felt warmer than usual, though that may have been my own restlessness seeping into the space. Mark had retreated to his study again, his presence distant and unnoticed. I had prepared everything just as before, the same table, the same books, the same structured approach. And yet, nothing about this felt the same. Elijah stepped inside with the same quiet confidence as before, his gaze scanning the space before settling on me. I motioned toward the table, and he took his seat without a word. For the first half of the session, we stayed on topic. I spoke about theories of perception, about how people interpret attraction based on their own biases. He listened, nodding, his attention unwavering. But something had shifted between us, something unspoken, yet unmistakable. As I continued talking, I noticed the way he sat, more relaxed than last time, his posture less rigid, his movements slower, more deliberate. There was an ease in the way he observed me now, a quiet understanding of the space we shared. And then, at some point, I felt it. The pause between words. The awareness that had been simmering just beneath the surface, now impossible to ignore. He made a small comment about how people fear what they don't understand. How assumptions shape the way we view connections that fall outside of convention. I knew he wasn't just talking about psychology. I looked at him then, really looked at him. The way his gaze held steady. The way his fingers traced the edge of the notebook absent-mindedly. The way he seemed to be waiting, though for what, I wasn't sure. I should have changed the subject. I should have looked away. Instead, I let the silence stretch, let the weight of the moment settle in the air between us. For the first time, I wasn't thinking as a professor. I wasn't thinking about right or wrong, about boundaries or expectations. I was just thinking about how close he was. And how easy it would be to close that distance. The sound of a door closing in the distance jolted me back to reality. Mark. The moment shattered like glass, the air between us shifting instantly. I straightened, reaching for the nearest book, forcing my voice back to its usual even tone. Elijah didn't move for a second. Then, slowly, he leaned back in his chair, exhaling through his nose, his expression unreadable. The rest of the session passed in a blur. When it was over, I walked him to the door once again. This time, there was no hesitation in his departure, but before stepping outside, he glanced at me, just a flicker of a look, something quiet and knowing. And then he was gone. I stood there, listening to the silence of the house, feeling the weight of my own thoughts pressing against my ribs. I had let the line blur. And I wasn't sure I wanted to pull it back. The weight of that evening settled into my bones, lingering long after Elijah had left. I told myself it was nothing, just another moment stretched too thin, an overanalyzed pause. But no matter how much I tried to rationalize it, the truth sat heavy in my chest. I had allowed something to shift, something irreversible. The days passed in a blur of routine. I went through my lectures, graded papers, answered emails. Mark moved through the house in his usual patterns, silent glances over the newspaper, murmured acknowledgements over dinner. If he noticed anything different about me, he didn't say. Maybe he had stopped paying attention long ago. And yet, I found myself waiting. Not for my husband's words. Not for the usual rhythm of my days. For Elijah. When he arrived for our next session, it felt inevitable. The moment I opened the door, I knew something had changed. The air felt thicker, the silence stretched just a little too long. He stepped inside without hesitation this time, his movements slower, more assured. He was no longer just a student asking for help. And I was no longer just a professor offering guidance. We both knew it. I led him to the usual space, setting the books in front of us like a barrier neither of us truly acknowledged. I went through the motions, flipping pages, pointing at key theories, speaking in the same even tone. But my own words barely registered. Because I could feel him. Not just his presence, but the weight of his attention. The way he was watching me, not like a student watching a professor, but like a person watching another person, waiting for something unspoken to be acknowledged. I turned a page. He shifted slightly. The space between us was closing, whether we admitted it or not. At one point, I reached for my glass of water, my fingers grazing the edge. It tipped slightly, not enough to spill, but enough for my hand to falter. Elijah's hand moved at the same time, steadying it. For the briefest second, his fingers brushed against mine. It should have been nothing. A simple reflex. A meaningless accident. But neither of us pulled away. The contact was barely there, just the warmth of skin against skin, the press of something unspoken lingering between us. My breath caught for just a fraction of a second. And then, slowly, I withdrew my hand. I looked up, meeting his gaze, and for the first time, I saw the question in his eyes. He was waiting for permission. I didn't give it. Not with words. But I didn't need to. The silence was enough. The way I didn't move, didn't break away. The way I let the air between us hum with the weight of something we could no longer ignore. I don't remember how long we sat like that. I only remember the moment he finally stood, gathering his things. The hesitation before he left. The way his eyes lingered on me, waiting for a final sign, a confirmation of something we both already knew. And when he finally stepped outside, disappearing into the night, I exhaled, my fingers still tingling where his had been. I turned, moving through the house in a daze, barely noticing the familiar surroundings. Then, as I stepped into the dim light of the hallway, I saw Mark. He was standing near the entrance to his study, his expression unreadable. For a moment, neither of us spoke. Then, finally, he sighed deep and tired, like he had already accepted whatever unspoken truth had settled between us. I didn't explain. I didn't need to. I just kept walking, leaving him behind in the quiet of the house that no longer felt like a home. And as I closed the bedroom door behind me, I realized I had already made my choice. There was no going back.